This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Ateli Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. Hong Kong's leader vows sweeping reforms and a corruption probe into building maintenance as the death toll from the city's deadliest fire climbs to 156. The US and France both targeting Shein. Texas opens a probe into its labor and safety practices, while in Paris, lawmakers put the China-founded fast fashion giant on the spot for undercutting high street rivals. And South Korea's president demands tougher punishment after the country's worst data leak in more than a decade. E-commerce group Coupang admitting that the breach exposed 33 million customers. China and Japan trade accusations over a tense Coast Guard clash near the disputed Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. They used to be in the pig butchering business of online fraud. Now, scammers deported back to China are turning to what they call foreigner butchering. Hong Kong's leaders promising systematic reforms and a thorough investigation after the city's deadliest fire in years. The death toll from Wang Fuk Court inferno has climbed to 156, and dozens are still unaccounted for.
Yes, it is a tragedy. It is a big fire. Yes, we need a reform. Yes, we have identified failures in different stages. That is exactly why we must act seriously to ensure that all these loopholes are plugged.
Well, Mr. Lee says they will find out if corruption played a hand in building maintenance after investigators found that contractors had deliberately covered up their use of unsafe materials. Police and the city's anti-corruption body have arrested at least 15 people who are now facing manslaughter charges. For the very latest, Deborah Wong joins us from Hong Kong. Deborah, John Lee says that the case uncovered failures that requires systemic reforms. Tell us more about the changes that he wants.
So there are two glaring issues that he raised here. I want to categorize this into two parts. Now, firstly, Mr. Lee says he'll be scrutinizing corruption, collusion, and whether any vested interests were involved, as well as review the roles and responsibility across authorized personnel, including the government departments. On top of that, he also talked about potential review of bid rigging. Now, Mr. Lee did not lay out any particular details with regards to the typo incident. But, in the year that just passed, residents have complained. Residents at the affected blocks where the typo fire blazed through have complained about, accusations of potential corruption, of bid rigging, because the entire renovation project cost about 330 million Hong Kong dollars, and residents had to shell out between 160,000 to 180,000 Hong Kong dollars. So, they also said that it was one of the more expensive options, and that's why they were uncomfortable with paying that amount of money. And also, the case is currently linked to District Councillor Peggy Wong. Peggy Wong was, part of was linked to the case because she was actually a consultant to the owners' corporation. Now, Wong herself has already distanced herself from the case, and she told the media that she will be taking action. She has filed a report with ICAC as well as the police. Now, next, secondly, Mr. Lee also covered safety reforms. On that front, he said that there's going to be a review of safety standards, including fire alarms, also having updated material lists, and as well as verified testing systems be transparent, and penalties will also be relooked. Now, this is significant because residents in the lead-up to the fire have complained about smokers, construction workers smoking on site. They've also complained about the integrity of the green netting that we saw go up in flames. And all these were eventually discovered to be non-compliant because the non-compliant nets were mixed with the compliant nets. So I did speak with some residents and an expert on the kind of changes we can expect in the construction industry going forward. Have a listen. It's common in Hong Kong to see construction works wrapped in these protective nets, but a deadly fire in Tai Po has shown they might not stand up to close scrutiny. Investigators found the netting had contributed to the flames spreading quickly at the Wang Fuk Court development, and authorities have now launched a city-wide inspection of construction sites and taken samples of such nets for testing. 30 sites in total, including this one on Hong Kong Island, have been ordered to suspend work for failing to meet safety standards. Most of them involve Prestige Construction, the firm behind the renovation at Wang Fuk Court. Hong Kong's Buildings Department says it's not confident of the firm's ability to ensure site safety.
I am quite worried about this situation because I thought that they will use the same material as Tai Po, so it would be a concern.
Affected companies must submit a safety plan to authorities and can only resume work upon approval. CNA spoke to an industry expert. He told us that approved work should be subject to surprise inspections in case of non-compliance in later stages of the renovation work. After all, latest findings show that at Wang Fuk Court, netting that met fire safety standards had been replaced with non-compliant ones, and they were deliberately placed at hard-to-reach spots to avoid detection.
Surprise means surprise, not an announced one carry no meaning. And with such a large number of projects under construction, we have to devise a smart system. Can we install some camera at the peripheral of the site so that in case there is a fire occur, the management or the security guard can notice possibly ahead and carry out actions.
The blocks at Wang Fuk Court had all been covered with scaffolding and netting. So the professor said in the case of large-scale residential renovations, contractors could renovate blocks in stages to mitigate risks. Even if no stop work orders were issued, contractors from various sites across Hong Kong in the last few days have started to remove scaffolding nets to assuage residents, like what we're seeing here in Sway Wall Court. Now, this is another large-scale residential site in the New Territories. There are 9 towers here, and renovation has been going on since 2023. So residents here have voiced concerns about safety standards before, and right after the deadly fire in Tai Po, they convened an emergency meeting to discuss countermeasures.
嗰度咧大火，即係令到我哋好擔心啦。因為我哋揾過好多其他嘅工程界嘅人士咧嚟，我哋自己測試啊，嗰啲棚網啊都燒得着嘅。咁但係嗰個維修公司佢就話佢有晒證書，有晒測試，話冇問題嘅，即係同我哋嗰個結果唔同嘅。所以而家我哋睇到大埔咁樣，我哋好擔心啦。
你擔心啦，呢啲係咪啊？如果真正起火嘅，你走都走唔切啦，係咪啊？又老嫩大細乜都人都有，係嘛？
Authorities are aware of the impact this devastating fire has had on Hong Kongers.
咁其實咧都有好多唔同嘅居民咧，都係有同我哋去表達嘅憂慮，就擔心咧呢一個棚架網咧，佢係有機會着火嘅，即係要 make sure 佢要係有呢個嘅阻燃嘅作用，甚至乎為咗咧即係釋除居民嘅疑慮咧，都可以考慮唔影響工期，唔會另外集資嘅情況之下咧，就要係拆晒嗰啲網。
As Hong Kong vows to tighten review processes, the city could expect rising costs and delays to construction timelines. But as the inferno that ripped through Wang Fuk Court has shown,
If you have the balance between safety and cost, there is actually no compromise of safety.
So, Deborah, I believe John Lee, he also mentioned about the Legislative Council election this weekend. What exactly did he say?
So there was some uncertainty at the start as to whether there would still be the Legislative Council elections as scheduled on Sunday because campaigning activity, all these forums were actually cancelled after the blaze started. And a lot of efforts were in fact channeled to relief work during the last few days. Now, Mr. Lee has confirmed that the election will proceed as planned, and he says that it's due to social stability, and he also wants to, make sure that this can proceed in accordance with the law. Now, Mr. Lee also says that it's important to elect new lawmakers who will be capable to help him push through certain policies. Basically, the LegCo would be responsible for approving budgets and for reviewing policy. So when asked whether he was, he did in fact consider the feelings of affected residents before making such a decision, Mr. Lee once again said that this boils down to social stability, and he said that the fire made the government reflect on the policies they have, the existing system that he has, and he needs to depend on a team, to enact any of the reforms that he has proposed.
Okay, Deborah, I'm going to bring in Sunny Loh into our conversation. He's an honorary professor for the Department of Politics and Public Administration at the University of Hong Kong. First up, thanks for joining us this evening, Professor. So I just want to talk about how analysts, right? I mean, they've been framing this whole episode as a litmus test for John Lee's administration. There were reports of sedition arrests. So help us understand, why has this whole case turned political?
The whole case turned political because of two major reasons. Number one, Mr. John Lee, as he mentioned in the press briefing, has to find out the problems concerned and then fix the problem. And secondly, he will need the new Legislative Council to come up with new bills and legislation in accordance with the recommendations to be worked out by the newly established Commission of Inquiry. So time is on his side, but he has to do things very quickly.
Professor, I want to also jump in here right now. Election campaigning halted last week. How do you think this might impact the elections going forward, especially with regards to voter turnout that the government has been trying to boost?
Now, the government has not mentioned any fixed target with regard to voter turnout, knowing that perhaps the voting turnout will be heavily affected by this incident. So it remains to be seen in these few days how political parties, especially the pro-government parties, are going to mobilize citizens, civil servants, and the employees of pro-government organizations to vote. So the turnout rate, even though the government is heavily mobilizing civil servants to vote, we can expect that the voter turnout will not be high. So at most, it will increase by 5 to 8%. However, the most important issue for us to observe is whether the pro-government Democratic Alliance for the Betterment and Progress of Hong Kong will be affected. Because before this fire accident, the DAB, the pro-government party, strategically divided its candidates into two groups in one particular geographical constituency. So among the 10 geographical constituencies, 3 constituencies saw DAB candidates splitting into two groups. So whether this strategy will work out or not remains to be seen, especially at a time, as you mentioned before, one DAB councillor was dragged into this fire accident controversy. So in other words, we will have to observe whether the centralist or the non-party affiliated candidate will grasp the opportunity to be elected in this upcoming election.
So quite a lot to look out for in this weekend's elections. But just moving ahead of the curve here a little, let's talk about the priorities. What can we expect this new LegCo to undertake in relation to the systemic reforms that we just heard from John Lee earlier?
Well, of course, the priority is to deal with these fire tragedies ramifications, especially with regard to the legislation concerning the construction and renovation sector, which has to plug all the existing loopholes. And secondly, the ICAC and also all the government departments concerned may have to do a better job to prevent another possible crisis. So I think time is quite urgent. So the new LegCo will have to work harder to plug all these loopholes, as mentioned by Mr. John Lee.
Many thanks for your insights, Honorary Professor Sunny Loh, as well as CNA's correspondent Deborah Wong, both speaking to us from Hong Kong. Right, on that note, we are going to go for a short break now, but coming up next on East Asia tonight, CNA's senior correspondent Lim Yon Suk reports from Seoul as e-commerce giant Coupang's massive data leak escalates into a national controversy. And South Korean auto stocks rally after Washington confirms it will retroactively cut import duties on their vehicles to 15% as of November 1st. Hello there. Good to have your company on East Asia tonight. It is time for a business, and I've got Roland Lim standing by. So, Roland, we're all talking about the Coupang data leak, that case in Korea now shaping to be a test case, apparently on how hard the regulators will punish corporate lapses. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, right you are. Big fines and lawsuits, and the data leak could also lead to longer-term problems of phishing as well as identity fraud that could erode consumer trust, as well as Coupang's valuation, also known as the Amazon of Korea. Now, South Korea's president demanding tougher penalties for corporate data breaches after what officials say is the country's worst leak in more than a decade. E-commerce giant Coupang confirmed that personal information belonging to 33 million customers had been exposed. President Lee Jae-myung calling the 5-month delay in detecting the breach astonishing. He's ordered a full review of penalties and said those responsible must be held accountable. Now, he warned that wrong practices and a lack of care for personal data must end, especially in the age of artificial intelligence. The breach is believed to have begun in June, but the company did not notify authorities until November. The leaked information includes names, emails, home addresses, and phone numbers. At a parliamentary hearing, Coupang's chief information security officer said the attacker used a stolen private encryption key to impersonate customers. Leadership now suspects a former Coupang engineer with privileged system access may have been behind the breach. The company now faces a police investigation, potential class action lawsuits, and fines that could exceed $680 million. Now, for more on this, CNA's senior correspondent Lim Yon-suk joins us live from Seoul. Yon-suk, thank you for being on the show. Now, President Lee Jae-myung calling for tougher penalties. How significant has been his response, and what does this signal about the government's next steps towards data protection?
Well, President Lee Jae-myung's response is significant because it is the strongest push yet by the South Korean government to tighten corporate accountability on data protection. Now, President Lee called this Coupang breach a wake-up call because, it really exposed how unprepared South Korean companies are when it comes to protecting personal data. Now, in this case, the fact that, information from 33 million users was leaked and Coupang didn't detect it for 5 months shows, really very serious gaps in security and oversight. Now, President Lee Jae-myung has indicated that the current regulation and the penalties may not be enough, and so he is ordering a full review of the damages to look into higher penalties and stronger legal safeguards. Because as you said, the maximum fine for negligent data management is up to 3% of a company's revenue. For Coupang, this means more than 1 trillion won. That's about $680 million.
So the leak was massive, 33 million customers. Presumably, South Koreans aren't actually positive about this massive leak. What's been the reaction on the ground?
Oh, definitely people are angry here and, angry, and that anger has been growing in recent days as more Koreans are learning more about this leak and, which is believed to be the worst data breach in more than a decade. Now, Coupang is something that most people here in South Korea use. So if data from 33 million users was exposed, it means that almost 2/3 of the country's entire population could have had their personal information compromised, and which is why the public reaction is very strong. Now, Koreans have started to take action. Reports saying that 14 users have already filed lawsuits demanding compensation for emotional distress and fear of future scams. And it's also very likely and definitely that number will grow as law firms are openly asking people to come forward, and online communities have also started discussing possible lawsuits. I think the main issue and the big issue here is that the leaked information includes very sensitive details like names, phone numbers, home addresses, and not just for yourself, but all the other people you might have delivered goods to from Coupang. And, you're talking about your workplace, your parents' home, your children's school's address, and that's why the anger here in South Korea is intense. Now, there was a parliamentary hearing over this Coupang leak, and there were lots of questions posed to Coupang about how this was possible and how it broke out. And let's hear what Coupang's security chief had to say.
All authentication tokens are validated against Coupang's private signing key. It is our belief that this private signing key, which should remain internal to Coupang, was obtained and has been used without authorization by a third party to generate forged tokens.
Now, he has said that investigation was still ongoing and that he doesn't think that there was more information leaked. But, there are now calls for Coupang founder Kim Bum-sok to come forward and personally apologize, as this could be South Korea's biggest ever collection action over a data leak.
Yun-suk, thanks for those updates. That was Lim Yun-suk reporting live from Seoul. Shares of Korean automakers climbed today after the U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick confirmed that tariffs on their vehicles will be retroactively lowered to 15%. Shares of Hyundai up 4.5% today, and the second biggest automaker in Korea, Kia Motors, also up by more than 4%. Mr. Lutnick says the move comes after South Korean lawmakers tabled a bill to move forward with Seoul's $350 billion investment pledge. That's a key condition for Washington to lower tariffs on imports from South Korea, which will be backdated to the 1st of November. South Korea's auto tariff rates now match those of rivals Japan and the EU, reducing the burden for the country's automakers. Meantime, consumer prices in South Korea continue to exceed the Bank of Korea's targets, driven by spikes in petroleum and agricultural products. Headline inflation came in at 2.4% last month. That's the third straight month above the central bank's 2% target. Now, this is the second longest streak so far this year, when prices rose above 2% for 4 straight months. That's from January to April. The country's statistics ministry says the biggest contributor to the overall increase were petroleum products, which were almost 6% higher from a year ago, while agricultural products was up 5.6% in the same period. And processed food also up by more than 3%. The ministry says a base effect, bad weather, and a weaker won influenced last month's figures, adding that it's closely monitoring prices of basic necessities. South Korean equities ending the day in the green. The benchmark Kospi index up by nearly 2% for the day, while the small cap Kosdaq index is up by 2/3%. Let's turn to Japan, where speculation is growing that the Bank of Japan could raise interest rates as soon as this month. Japanese stocks ending flat in lackluster trade a day after the sharp sell-off sparked by that speculation. The tech-focused Nikkei index finishing the session unchanged from yesterday's close, while the broader topics added less than 0.1%. The yen strengthened against the dollar yesterday. The yen is currently now weaker against the greenback by 0.33%, 155.94 to the dollar. Still hovering, though, at its strongest level in a week as investors price in better returns on yen assets. Meantime, yields on 2-year and 10-year Japanese government bonds are still around 17-year highs as investors dumped their existing debt holdings ahead of an expected rate hike and the higher yielding bonds that would follow. Shares of SoftBank slid more than 5% in its third straight session of losses as AI valuation concerns continue to mount. The tech conglomerate's CEO, Masayoshi Son, said during a forum in Japan that he was, quote, trying to sell NVIDIA shares to fund his company's investments in AI, which includes OpenAI. Now, SoftBank also backs Coupang. More market action. Chinese stocks closed lower as investors stayed cautious ahead of key policy meetings and amid a seasonal earnings lull, while Hong Kong shares were little changed. Shanghai Composite down for the day, 0.42%. Second bourse, the Shenzhen Composite down by 2/3%. Hang Seng Index slightly higher, 26,095 points. Shares of many Chinese electric vehicle makers trading lower after mostly sluggish sales growth in the month of November. Now, analysts are saying early signs of weakening demand that's clouding the outlook for 2026 for EVs. BYD, though, remains an outlier, with shares closing up more than 2% despite reporting a drop in sales in November from a year earlier. Investors are cheering that the EV maker is on track to meet its target of 1 million exported units for 2025 due to robust overseas demand. And that is the latest in business. Charlie.
Thanks so much for that, Roland. Well, we are going to go for another break now, but coming up on East Asia tonight.
Neither Golden Age nor Ice Age.
The UK wants better ties with China, even as it calls Beijing a national security threat. You're watching East Asia tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. Hong Kong's leader vows reforms and a thorough investigation into the city's biggest fire disaster in years. His government promising to look into possible corruption on building maintenance. A fast fashion giant, Shein, under scrutiny from both sides of the Atlantic. Its management will appear before French lawmakers, while the government is pushing for a suspension of its website. And over in the U.S., politicians spearhead investigations over unethical business practices. South Korean President Lee Jae-myung demands tougher penalties as e-commerce giant Coupang admits its data leak exposed the personal information of 33 million customers. Well, the UK is defending moves to deepen engagement with China, even as it warns of national security threats posed by Beijing. Our Prime Minister Keir Starmer says that closer business ties are important and British companies should seize trade opportunities with the world's second largest economy.
It's time for a serious approach, to reject the simplistic binary choice, neither Golden Age nor Ice Age, and recognise the plain fact that you can work and trade with a country while still protecting yourself.
The British leader urges sectors without significant security risks to improve cooperation with China, which he describes as a defining force in tech, trade and global governance. But he maintains that Britain does not compromise national security with economic access. Relations have been strained after the UK accused Beijing of spying on Westminster and parliamentary staff. China has pushed back on those allegations, saying that it has no interest in intelligence from British Parliament and that the accusations are unfounded. Now, tens of thousands of Chinese scammers have been deported back home from Southeast Asia in recent years. While overseas, they primarily targeted fellow Chinese nationals. Well, now that they are back on home soil, some have resumed their old activities, and this time they're going after foreigners. CNA Tan Se-hui with this report.
我当时也是鬼迷心窍了，因为中国人不骗中国人，只骗外国人，就没人管。
This report by state media CCTV was about a case in Tao County in eastern Shandong province where police busted a scam syndicate targeting foreigners. It's a new form of scheme that's locally known as Shayangpan, or foreigner butchering scams.
These foreigner butchering scams look almost identical to those run out of scam compounds in Southeast Asia. Operated by well-organized criminal groups, scammers pose as wealthy, attractive individuals on social media platforms such as Facebook and Instagram, which are banned in China. Once they make contact, they move the target onto chat apps. Using scripted lines and translation tools, they build rapport, earn trust, and gradually draw victims in.
Most cases involve scammers pitching crypto investment opportunities with promises of high returns. But once victims put in larger sums, the scammers shut down the platforms and disappear. In one case targeting Indian nationals, more than 66,000 victims lost more than $5 million to scammers.
State media also reported that some scammers tapped their overseas networks or used know-how they picked up abroad to set up local scam operations targeting foreigners. The rise in crypto-related scams targeting non-Chinese victims comes as countries like the US are reporting a surge in cases involving their own citizens. The U.S. recently launched the Scam Center Strike Force, an interagency task force against crypto investment fraud schemes in Southeast Asia that target its citizens. U.S. officials estimate that Americans lost $10 billion to these operations in 2024, a 66% increase from the previous year. Authorities have linked much of the activity to Chinese organized crime affiliates operating across Southeast Asia.
So this scamdemic is certainly a generational wealth transfer from Main Street USA into the hands of Chinese organized crime, making it both a national security problem and a homeland security problem.
But some analysts have cautioned against politicizing the issue or framing it as a confrontation with China.
Well, let's find out more from Jason Tower, a senior expert with the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Well, thanks, Jason, for joining us. Just to start, I want to get to the heart of what you have been tracking on the ground, which is this foreigner butchering phenomenon in China. You've written extensively about that. How deep does the rot actually go?
Yeah, this is pretty significant. I mean, you've seen where China has repatriated over 100,000 people over the last 2 years from Southeast Asia. Many of these individuals have been given criminal charges. They subsequently cannot find jobs on China's highly competitive job market because of that criminal record. So you are seeing that more and more of these foreigner butchering syndicates are actually being set up across cities all across the country. The problem is so challenging at this point that the Chinese police have actually found it necessary to start major public education campaigns trying to address the problem of foreigner butchering, where basically they're educating the Chinese public that scamming foreigners is also a crime. I think the background story here is that you saw as China's crackdowns on online scams picked up in 2021 and then again in 2023, that you started to see the syndicates pivot in terms of largely targeting victims outside of China. Also in terms of how they're going about recruitment, they're starting to develop new narratives to justify their scams in the eyes of new recruits, including telling people quite openly, and you've seen influencers actually post videos about this on popular applications such as TikTok, where they talk about, patriotic scamming, where basically, that some of these scam syndicates, they're not scamming Chinese, that scamming foreigners is not a crime, and that they won't be prosecuted if they focus on foreign targets. So I think that this kind of dovetails with the phenomenon that you're seeing also across the Southeast Asia region, where the vast majority of these scam syndicates are all now expanding or pivoting to target individuals in the US and Australia, Japan, and in other countries.
That you're talking about, but I want to touch on the loopholes as well. I mean, how do we interpret the fact that, despite China's bans on crypto trading and Western social media, that scammers are still actually using all these offshore accounts and apps like Facebook and Instagram, TikTok, as you've mentioned, to target these foreigners?
I think in part it's because Chinese law enforcement has taken some of these steps. It's made it increasingly more difficult for these scam syndicates to scam in China. That said, though, I mean, they've developed some incredibly sophisticated methodologies from perpetrating these forms of scams across China, and they're now really weaponizing that to target the rest of the globe. So I think that that's in part what we're seeing. There's larger and larger losses coming from the US, coming from the UK, coming from other countries. I highlighted in my report this case of a scam syndicate that actually scammed 66,000 Indians over a period of 6 months. So it sort of shows how this is increasingly going global. As crackdowns are, advancing and efforts by law enforcement to check this are moving ahead, you're also seeing where the scams are becoming much more complex in terms of the individuals that are involved. So to give an example of this, you have documented cases of a Chinese-led scam syndicate operating in Myanmar, trafficking individuals from Indonesia that they then deploy to scam victims in Malaysia. So that makes these crimes very difficult to prosecute. It requires cooperation across law enforcement, sometimes from 4 or 5 countries, to deal with these problems. And I think as moving forward, we're seeing that efforts by law enforcement are increasingly being undermined by criminal actors who are adopting more and more sophisticated approaches to perpetrating these crimes.
I suppose, that's why we're seeing a flurry of U.S. enforcement actions. On top of that, we have heard from Washington that they're calling this a generational wealth transfer to Chinese organized crime. How do you see, the way this is all framed, how do you think that's going to affect U.S.-China relations? They are already fraught.
Yeah, well, there may be some parallels here with the fentanyl crisis. There's a chance that this could become a flashpoint between the two countries because it's true that you have China-linked crime groups that are running amok across the region, including back in China, that increasingly are making, scamming money, stealing money from Americans their top priority. That's where you're seeing the main focus of a lot of these pig butchering or these online scam syndicates. They're really increasingly focusing on the U.S. Now, that said, China and the U.S. and China have set up a joint working group to start addressing some of the challenges around fentanyl. And I think there are some parallels here to the fentanyl problem. In this case, you've seen where crime that initially was targeting China, that's being perpetrated by Chinese criminals, is now pivoting to harm Americans. If you had a similar type of platform where there could be information shared between law enforcement, you might then start to see more effective crackdowns take place. I think it's also important, though, and I think that this really is one of the main reasons why you're seeing the U.S. mobilize to address this issue, is that U.S. law enforcement itself needs to have good evidence, good information about what is happening. So increasingly, there's a need to trace where all of this money is going, and it's a lot of money. The most recent figures announced by the State Department is that over the past year, Americans have lost over $10 billion to these scams, which represents a 60% growth in losses year on year from the previous year. So if things continue at this trend, losses for the U.S. are going to become astronomical in a few years. So this is reaching a breaking point where the U.S. is increasingly detecting this as a threat to national security. And you're seeing that families, individuals across the United States are losing everything. In some cases, victims have been traumatized by this to the point where they've even committed suicide.
Well, this sounds like it's clearly a crime problem with real geopolitical stakes in it as well. Well, many thanks for your insights. Most helpful, Jason Tower, a senior expert with Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Well, we are going to go for another break now, but coming up on East Asia tonight, Chinese retailer Shein under pressure and scrutiny on both sides of the Atlantic is a subject of a counterfeit probe in the U.S. and a French parliament inquiry for selling banned items. Chinese online retail giants Shein and Temu under scrutiny in the U.S. Two senior politicians are leading an investigation into alleged unethical business practices. The Texas Attorney General has launched a probe into Shein, mirroring a move made by several European countries. Well, he cites several reports over potential violations of the state's labor laws with the use of unsafe materials and deceptive marketing. In Washington, the Republican senator of Arkansas wants an investigation by the Justice Department and the Department of Homeland Security into alleged wide-scale counterfeiting by Shein and Temu. Well, meantime, members of Shein's management are scheduled to appear before the French Parliament today. Representatives from the online fashion giant will answer questions from lawmakers following a scandal over its sale of childlike sex dolls and weapons. Shein has disabled its marketplace in France since the beginning of November, where third-party sellers offered their products after the offending items were found. But part of the site that offers Shein's own clothing range is still accessible. The French government wants the fashion retailer to tighten controls over its products. For now, it's requesting the suspension of the company's entire website for 3 months. A hearing on this request will take place this Friday. And for more, we're going to bring in Ross Cullen reporting for CNA live from Paris. So basically, Shein's management, what are they expected to say to these French lawmakers?
Hi, Telly. Well, Shein is likely to point out the fact that it has carried out a thorough review, and it says it's going to be imposing stricter requirements for sellers after the discovery of childlike sex dolls being sold on its online platform, and it will probably reiterate the message that it was outraged and appalled by the fact there was the presence of these dolls and also weapons being able to be bought on Shein's website. The management executives are also likely to tell French lawmakers that there are tens of millions of people in France who use Shein regularly. We're coming up to Christmas, the festive period. Lots of people are likely to be going online to try to buy gifts, and they will also be outlining to French MPs that they are a critical part of France's online retail landscape.
Ross, now this French government, they have requested a full 3-month suspension of Shein under its digital economy law. But how likely is the judge to grant that suspension?
Yeah, so 83 MPs have written a letter calling for a ban on Shein's activities here in France. They say that such a ban would protect workers, public health and the planet. They say in a letter that, quote, it's not fashion that's becoming more accessible, it's Shein that's shedding its negative image. It's already been fined $221 million this year by France for false promotions and misleading ads. And under the Digital Economy Act, it would be Article 6.3 that a judge might be able to invoke later on this year, which would be able to bring in measures aimed at preventing harm caused by online content. They would have to check that such a law does indeed satisfy EU law, and also if it is indeed warranted. That's something that the 83 MPs believe is warranted, and they will be having their chance to question Shein executives today. Telly?
Many thanks for that. Ross Cullen reporting live for CNA from Paris. In other news, China and Japan's coast guards say or rather, they're giving conflicting statements after a confrontation between their vessels around the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands. China says that a Japanese fishing boat illegally entered the waters of the contested islands and was expelled early this morning. But Japan's Coast Guard says it intercepted and expelled 2 Chinese Coast Guard vessels when they approached the fishing boat. The Japan-administered Senkaku Islands, known as Diaoyu in China, have been a flashpoint between the two countries for years now. Will the standoff at sea happen with Beijing and Tokyo still locked in a diplomatic row over Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi's suggestion that her country could take military action if China attacks Taiwan?
For Kazuyuki Tanioka, this restaurant has been his pride and his life. The 52-year-old Japanese national has been serving omakase menus in Beijing for more than a decade. Diners used to book weeks in advance, but things have taken a sharp turn.
生意特别不好。我们10年前开的餐厅，最近10年，这个月生意最不好了。
This comes amid the latest diplomatic spat between China and Japan. Tensions flared after Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi suggested Chinese action on Taiwan could prompt a military response from Tokyo, comments that angered Beijing.
11月中到现在，好多客人预约取消了，大概15桌，一共60多个客户。 中国对那个日本的那个关系不太好嘛，好多中国人不要吃日餐。现在
Mr. Tanioka says this fallout has hit business harder than COVID. He just welcomed China lifting its 2-year ban on Japanese seafood imports in early November, before reports emerged they could be suspended again. The restaurant had already switched to Chinese and European seafood, but with fewer diners, high rent, and staff to pay, it may not be enough.
有可能明年我们关门，国家对国家的那关系是我们控制不了了，没办法。但是我觉得，美食和有钱不要分国境。
Some of Mr. Tanioka's Japanese friends are considering leaving China. he's thinking of doing the same and opening a restaurant in Tokyo instead, even if it means being apart from his wife, who is Chinese.
I've spoken to other Japanese outlets here in Beijing, and many declined to appear on camera due to heightened sensitivities. But what I can tell you is that this restaurant isn't the only one that's affected. Some have told me that bookings have plunged by as much as 70 to 80% since the latest diplomatic row began, although others say they've not noticed an impact to their business. And then there are some who say they've learned from previous times of tensions and they've diversified their seafood sources, importing from places like Spain and Canada.
The row has also seen Japanese films have their China releases postponed, concerts of Japanese musicians cancelled, and official exchanges put on hold. Frequent traveler Yan Jun faced a dilemma when China warned citizens to avoid visiting Japan, also as Chinese airlines cut hundreds of Japan-bound flights this month.
如果你真的时间很 tight， 然后你有很多急事要办的话，你还是要把这些事情，最好做减法。
Still, she's going ahead with her trip.
我多方面的朋友，从日本回来的以及在日本的，他们都跟我，他们的第一口就是亲口告诉我还是安全的。
Analysts say China's response has been within its playbook. Chinese netizens and state media have hit out at Japan strongly. But offline reactions have not reached the intensity of 2012. Back then, anti-Japan protests were held in many Chinese cities over disputed islands in the East China Sea.
Economies on both sides don't look the same as they did, 15 years ago. So the PRC is, not growing as fast. Now, the militaries also look very different. The PRC is far stronger now than it used to be. So, there are multiple calculations and also domestic concerns.
Beijing has demanded a retraction from Japan's premier, but with neither side backing down, analysts warn this spat could drag on, leaving ordinary people to navigate the uncertainty. Tan Sihui, CNA, Beijing.
Now, emergency crews are racing to reach survivors as the death toll from floods and landslides across Asia tops 1,200. Our three powerful cyclones, Ditwa, Sanya and Koto, battered the region, leaving thousands stranded and homes destroyed. Well, Indonesia has been hit hardest. More than 750 were killed and 500 others missing. Around 1 million people have been forced from their homes. Military and rescue teams are delivering aid by air and sea to cut off communities. Well, southern Thailand recorded at least 176 deaths. Cleanup has started. Roads, water and electricity are being restored. Over in Sri Lanka, Cyclone Ditwa triggered floods and landslides that killed 410 people, more than 350 others still missing. Thousands remain stranded. Military helicopters are airlifting residents, while relief camps provide food and water. Officials warn more rain could worsen conditions. Well, India, meantime, has offered support to its neighbour. Prime Minister Narendra Modi spoke with Sri Lanka's president, promising continued aid for relief and recovery. India also felt the impact of Ditwa as heavy rain lashed the south, resulting in 3 deaths. And that does it for East Asia tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia. And you can always find us on Facebook and YouTube. Thanks for watching.